I have watched grown men collapse under the weight of their own lies. I have watched mothers scream when verdicts were read. I have watched defendants sit so still, so cold, that the entire courtroom seemed to lose its warmth around them. But I will tell you something honestly. In all my years on the bench, I never expected a homeless 12-year-old boy with a torn backpack and muddy shoes to walk into my courtroom and expose a secret that a wealthy man had buried for almost a decade. The boy's name was Ethan Brooks, and when I first saw him, he was not sitting at the plaintiff's table. He was not surrounded by lawyers. He was not dressed for court. He was sitting in the back row beside a social worker, wearing a faded gray hoodie that looked too thin for the winter outside. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. His eyes never stayed in one place for more than a few seconds. That is something I notice as a judge. People think the most important testimony happens on the witness stand, but sometimes the truth reveals itself before anyone speaks. It shows in the way someone breathes, the way someone avoids a name, the way someone reacts when evidence is placed on the table. And Ethan looked like a child who had learned very early that the world could punish him even when he did the right thing. The case was supposed to be simple. At least that was how it appeared on the docket that morning. A local businessman named Richard Whitmore had filed a complaint involving stolen money, public disturbance, and what his attorney described as malicious interference with private property. Those were polished words, carefully chosen words, the kind lawyers use when they want something ugly to sound respectable. Richard Whitmore was not just any businessman. In that city, people knew his name. He owned real estate, donated to charity events, appeared in photographs with city officials, and had his name printed on plaques inside hospital wings and school gymnasiums. Men like Whitmore often enter a courtroom believing the walls already respect them. He walked in wearing a dark navy suit, silver watch, perfect tie, not expensive in a loud way, expensive in a quiet way, the kind of wealth that does not ask to be noticed because it assumes everyone already has. He took his seat near the front and gave me a small, controlled nod, no fear. No nervousness, not even irritation, just control. Years on the bench teach you how to recognize control. Innocent people can be calm, yes, but there is a difference between calm and performance. Richard Whitmore looked like a man who had rehearsed every facial expression before stepping through those doors. Beside him sat his attorney, Gregory Wells, a sharp man with a voice like polished glass. Mr. Wells had appeared before me before. He was intelligent, aggressive, and very good at turning small facts into large shadows. That morning he stood and explained that Ethan Brooks, a homeless miner, had allegedly found a leather envelope containing $10,000 behind Whitmore's downtown office building. According to Whitmore, the money belonged to him. According to the complaint, Ethan had stolen it, concealed it, and only returned it after being confronted by security. But the part that disturbed me immediately was not the money. It was what happened after the boy returned it. Because according to the social worker's statement, Ethan had not run away. He had not spent the cash. He had not tried to hide it. He had walked 3 blocks to a police substation and handed the envelope to an officer. Inside were exactly $10,000 in cash, $100 bills neatly wrapped, no wallet. No identification, no bank slip, just money. Now ask yourself this, if a homeless child finds $10,000 and turns it into the police, why does the wealthy man who claims to own that money become furious enough to drag that child into court? That question sat with me before the hearing even began, and believe me, it sat with the jury too. Ethan was not on trial in the criminal sense, not yet. But Whitmore's complaint had triggered a series of inquiries that placed the boy under suspicion. That is how the system can sometimes feel to people with nothing. A rich man points, and suddenly a poor child has to explain why he is not guilty. I remember looking down from the bench and watching Ethan's social worker, Karen Miller, lean close to whisper something to him. Ethan nodded, but he did not look reassured. Then Richard Whitmore turned his head, only for 1 second. He looked back at the boy, and Ethan froze. Not flinched, froze. There is a difference. A flinch is fear of what might happen, freezing his memory. I felt the air in my courtroom change in that moment. The prosecutor assigned to the matter, Assistant District Attorney Laura Bennett, noticed it too. I saw her pen stop moving. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Whitmore, then back again. That is when I first understood this was not going to be a case about found money. It was going to be about why a child was terrified of the man claiming to be the victim. Mr. Wells began confidently. He told the court that Richard Whitmore had withdrawn the $10,000 for a private business transaction. He said the envelope must have slipped from Whitmore's briefcase near the alley behind his office. He described Ethan as a troubled street child who had been seen in the area before. I did not like that phrase, troubled street child. Lawyers sometimes use labels when facts are weak. Labels make people smaller. Labels make the audience forget there is a human being sitting in front of them. Ethan lowered his head when he heard it. I watched the jury watch him, and I knew they saw what I saw. A boy who looked hungry, exhausted, and ashamed for being alive in a room full of adults, deciding what his honesty was worth. Then Laura Bennett stood. She did not raise her voice. Good prosecutors do not always need volume. Sometimes quiet confidence is far more dangerous. She said, "Your Honor, the state has reason to believe the money may be connected to a separate matter." Gregory Wells immediately objected. Too quickly. That mattered. Experienced attorneys object fast when something is improper. Guilty men's attorneys object fast when something is dangerous. I asked Ms. Bennett to explain. She looked toward Ethan, then toward Whitmore, and for the first time that morning, I saw Richard Whitmore's perfect expression crack, only slightly. A tightening around the jaw, a slow blink, a hand moving to adjust a tie that was already straight, small things. But in a courtroom, small things can be the first sound of a wall beginning to break. Ms. Bennett informed the court that when Ethan turned in the money, he made a statement to the responding officer. Not a long statement, not a dramatic accusation. Just one sentence that no one in that police substation knew what to do with. She said, the boy told the officer he had seen that same envelope before. The courtroom became quiet, not ordinary quiet, courtroom quiet, the kind where every cough disappears, every chair stops moving, and even the people in the gallery seem afraid to breathe. I looked at Ethan. His face had gone pale. Then I looked at Whitmore. He was staring straight ahead. Miss Bennett continued. He said he remembered the envelope because it was in the hand of a man who came to the abandoned motel where his mother disappeared. At that moment, even I had to sit still for a second longer than usual. Because every judge has cases that arrive with paperwork, and then there are cases that arrive with ghosts. I asked Ms. Bennett whose disappearance she was referring to. She opened a thin file, and the sound of those pages turning felt louder than it should have. Marissa Brooks, she said, Ethan's mother. Missing since October 14th, 8 years ago. The jury shifted. Someone in the gallery whispered Richard Whitmore did not move. But Ethan did. The boy slowly lifted his eyes toward me, and I saw it there. Not confusion, not anger, recognition. As if he had been waiting 8 years for someone in authority to finally say his mother's name inside a room where powerful people were forced to listen. Then Miss Bennett said something that changed the entire direction of that morning. Your Honor, the state believes Mr. Whitmore's response to the returned money may have revealed knowledge he should not have had. I leaned forward. Explain that. She turned toward the court officer. A sealed evidence bag was brought forward. Inside was the leather envelope, brown, worn at the edges, and marked with a small gold monogram, R.W. Richard Whitmore's initials. At first, that seemed to support his claim, but Miss Bennett did not look satisfied. She looked troubled. Then she said, the envelope also contains a partial fingerprint recovered from the inner flap. Gregory Wells stood again. Your Honor? I raised my hand. He stopped. The entire courtroom watched Miss Bennett. Ethan's breathing became visible from where I sat. And Richard Whitmore, for the first time since entering my courtroom, looked away from me. Miss Bennett said, that fingerprint does not belong to Richard Whitmore. She paused. And in that silence, I knew the next words were going to pull this courtroom into something far darker than stolen money. It belongs to Marissa Brooks. When Assistant District Attorney Laura Bennett said that Marissa Brooks's fingerprint was found inside the envelope, no one in my courtroom reacted normally. That is something people misunderstand about shocking moments. They expect gasps. They expect shouting. They expect chaos. But sometimes the truth enters a room so quietly that everyone is too afraid to move. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. No papers shifting, no whispering, no cough from the gallery. Just the soft hum of the courtroom lights above us and a 12-year-old boy staring at a brown leather envelope as if it had reached out from the past and placed his mother's hand on the table. I looked at Ethan Brooks. His lips parted slightly. But no sound came out. Karen Miller, his social worker, reached for his shoulder. He did not pull away, but he did not seem to feel her touch either. His eyes stayed locked on that envelope. And Richard Whitmore became very still. Now listen carefully, because this is where courtroom experience matters. A guilty person does not always panic. Sometimes panic looks like stillness. The body understands danger before the face admits it. The muscles tighten. The breathing becomes controlled. The eyes stop wandering because the mind is suddenly calculating every possible exit. Whitmore did not look at the envelope. He looked at Laura Bennett. That told me something. He was not surprised by the object. He was measuring the person who had revealed it. Gregory Wells stood again, slower this time. Your Honor, he said, this is highly prejudicial. We are here regarding the recovery of funds. Not to reopen an unrelated missing person matter from 8 years ago. Unrelated, that word landed badly. Even jurors who had been trying to remain neutral shifted in their seats. Because once a missing mother's fingerprint appears inside the property of the man accusing her homeless son of theft, nothing feels unrelated anymore. I asked Mr. Wells a simple question. Are you disputing that the fingerprint belongs to Marissa Brooks? He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. A courtroom can survive many things, but hesitation from a confident attorney is rarely invisible. We have not had the opportunity to independently examine that report, he said. That was lawyer language for it. I cannot deny it yet. I turned to Ms. Bennett. How was the identification made? She explained that Marissa Brooks had been fingerprinted years earlier after filing for emergency housing assistance, part of a municipal identification program for vulnerable residents. Her prints were stored in a local database. When the envelope was processed after Ethan turned it in, the partial print inside the flap produced a match. It was not enough to solve a disappearance, not alone, but it was enough to make the air in that courtroom feel heavier. I asked when the print might have been placed there. Miss Bennett looked down at her file. The forensic technician cannot determine the exact date, Your Honor, but the print was found beneath residue consistent with old adhesive from a previously sealed interior pocket. I remember that sentence clearly, because judges hear many technical details, but every now and then one detail opens a door. A previously sealed interior pocket. That meant the envelope had not simply been handled casually. Someone had used it, sealed it, opened it, and preserved it. And if Marissa Brooks had touched the inside of that envelope before she disappeared, then the money Ethan found behind Whitmore's office was not merely lost cash. It was a thread, and someone had pulled it too hard. I looked toward Ethan again. Ethan, I said gently, do you understand what is being discussed? Gregory Wells immediately objected to the court questioning the child directly. I overruled him. There are moments when procedure must remain intact, but humanity cannot be absent. That boy had been spoken about as evidence, as trouble, as a street child, as a problem. I wanted him at least once to hear his own name from the bench like he was a person. Ethan nodded. Barely. I asked, do you remember seeing this envelope before? His eyes moved to Richard Whitmore. That was all. He did not answer with words, but the entire courtroom saw the answer. Bennett requested permission to call Ethan as a preliminary witness. Mr. Wells objected again, arguing that the boy was emotionally unstable, suggestible, and being guided by adults who wanted to connect Whitmore to an old tragedy. Those words made Ethan look down again. And I have to tell you, that moment disturbed me. Because there are ways to challenge testimony without crushing the witness. There are ways to defend a client without making a child feel like his poverty is evidence against his honesty. But Gregory Wells was not trying to find the truth. He was trying to make the truth embarrassed of itself. I allowed limited questioning. Ethan was escorted to the witness stand. He looked smaller up there. Courtrooms are not designed for children. The witness chair is too large. The microphone feels too formal. The oath sounds too heavy. And when a child raises his right hand to promise the truth, every adult in the room should feel the weight of what brought him there. Bennett began softly. Ethan, how old were you when your mother disappeared? He swallowed. 4. His voice was so quiet, the court reporter asked him to repeat it. 4, he said again. Do you remember your mother? He nodded. What do you remember? Ethan looked at his hands. She smelled like vanilla soap, he said, and she sang in the car when she was scared. That sentence moved through the courtroom differently than evidence. Evidence enters the mind. Mirror enters the chest. One juror wiped her eye quickly. Hoping no one noticed. I noticed. Judges notice everything. Miss Bennett asked him about the abandoned motel. Ethan's breathing changed. He said his mother had taken him there for 2 nights because they had nowhere else to go. She told him it was temporary. She told him she was meeting someone who could help them. He remembered rain. He remembered a broken vending machine. He remembered sitting on the carpet with a toy truck while his mother spoke to a man outside the door. Do you remember the man? Miss Bennett asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at Whitmore again. Richard Whitmore stared straight ahead, Miss. Bennett asked, "Is the man you remember in the courtroom today?" The defense table became motionless. I saw Gregory Wells place one hand gently on Whitmore's arm. A warning, do not react. Ethan's face tightened. "Yes," he whispered. "Can you point to him?" Ethan lifted his hand slowly, not confidently, not dramatically. Like every inch of movement cost him something, and he pointed at Richard Whitmore. The gallery erupted into whispers. I struck the gavel once. Order. But inside, I understood the shock because the city knew Richard Whitmore as a donor, a businessman, a polished success story. They knew him from newspaper photographs, charity auctions, ribbon cuttings, and speeches about protecting vulnerable families. And now a homeless boy was pointing at him from the witness stand, saying he had seen him the night his mother vanished. Mr. Wells rose for cross-examination. His voice remained smooth. "Ethan, you were 4 years old, correct?" "Yes." "That was 8 years ago?" "Yes." "You have lived in shelters, foster placements, and temporary housing since then?" Karen Miller stiffened. Bennett objected. I allowed the question but watched carefully. Ethan nodded. Mr. Wells stepped closer. "So your life has been unstable. Your memories may be confused. People may have told you things. You may have seen Mr. Whitmore's face on television or in newspapers and mixed that image with something from your childhood. Isn't that possible?" Ethan did not answer. Mr. Wells leaned into the silence. "That money could have changed your life, couldn't it?" Still no answer. $10,000, food, clothes, a room, safety. You could have kept it. Ethan's eyes filled, but he did not cry. Then he said something that silenced even Mr. Wells. "My mom told me never to keep what wasn't mine." For a moment, Gregory Wells had no follow-up. I looked at Richard Whitmore, and there it was again, that crack in the mask, not guilt exactly, not yet, but anger, cold, controlled anger. Not because the boy was lying, because the boy had not stayed invisible. Bennett then asked Ethan one final question. "When you found the envelope behind Mr. Whitmore's office, why did you say you had seen it before?" Ethan looked at the evidence bag. His voice became even smaller because my mom put something inside it. Miss Bennett paused. "What did she put inside?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. She told me to stay in the bathroom, but I saw her crying. She put papers inside." Then the man came. They argued. What did they argue about? Ethan's mouth trembled. He looked at me then, not at the lawyers, and I knew he was not speaking to the court anymore. He was speaking to the only adult in the room who could force everyone to listen. He said if she talked, nobody would believe a woman like her. The words settled over us like dust from a collapsed ceiling. I had heard that sentence before in different forms, across hundreds of cases. Nobody will believe you. Predators, abusers, corrupt men, powerful people hiding dirty things, so many of them rely on that same sentence. It is not just a threat. It is a strategy. It teaches victims to silence themselves before the world ever gets a chance to ignore them. I looked at Whitmore again. This time he was looking at Ethan, and the expression on his face was not fear, it was recognition. Miss Bennett said she had one more item to present before the court decided whether the matter should be expanded into a formal inquiry. A court officer wheeled in a monitor. The screen came alive. Grainy black and white security footage appeared. It showed the alley behind Whitmore's office building on the night Ethan found the envelope. At first, nothing happened, just rain, a dumpster, a back door, then a figure appeared on the screen, a man in a dark coat. He moved quickly, looked over his shoulder, and placed the leather envelope behind a loose brick near the wall. His face was partially hidden, but the courtroom leaned forward as one body because even before the image sharpened, I saw Richard Whitmore lower his head. And that was when I realized something that made my hand tighten around the edge of the bench. The man on the screen was not Richard Whitmore. It was someone else, someone who had just entered my courtroom. The man on the security footage was not Richard Whitmore. And yet, the moment that figure appeared on the screen, Richard Whitmore lowered his head as if he already knew the damage was done. I followed his eyes. Then I looked toward the back of the courtroom. A man had just slipped through the double doors. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, wearing a brown jacket and holding a folded cap in both hands. He did not look wealthy. He did not look powerful. In fact, He looked like the kind of man most people pass every day without remembering his face, but I remembered him. His name was Thomas Grady. He was Whitmore's former maintenance supervisor. I had seen his name in the preliminary documents as a minor witness, someone who had worked in one of Whitmore's downtown properties years earlier. He had not been scheduled to testify that morning, not officially, and yet there he was. Standing frozen at the back of my courtroom while his own image played on the evidence screen. Believe me when I tell you, there are few sounds more revealing than silence. After a person sees himself inside evidence he thought no one would ever find. Thomas Grady did not move. Richard Whitmore did not look back at him. That told me more than either man understood. People connected by innocence look toward each other in confusion. People connected by secrets avoid each other in fear. Miss Bennett turned slowly. Mr. Grady, she said, please remain where you are. Gregory Wells stood so fast his chair struck the table behind him. Your Honor, this is improper. Mr. Grady has not been called. This footage has not been authenticated in open court. His voice was still controlled, but the smoothness was gone. The polished glass had cracked. I asked Miss Bennett how she obtained the footage. She explained that after Ethan turned in the envelope, investigators reviewed cameras from businesses surrounding Whitmore's office. Most footage had been overwritten, but a small locksmith shop across the alley had recently upgraded its security system. The owner had saved older backup files because of repeated vandalism complaints. That small decision changed everything. That is something I have learned after years on the bench. People imagine justice arrives through dramatic confessions and brilliant speeches. Sometimes it arrives because a tired shop owner forgot to delete an old hard drive. The footage was from 3 nights before Ethan found the envelope. It showed Thomas Grady entering the alley after midnight, removing a brick and placing the envelope inside the wall. He looked nervous. He looked over his shoulder twice. Then he walked away. But the most disturbing part was what happened next. The video continued. Less than 2 minutes later, Richard Whitmore stepped into the same alley. He did not appear surprised. He did not search. He walked directly to the brick, touched it, checked the envelope, then placed it back. That was not a man recovering lost property. That was a man verifying a hidden object. The jury saw it. The prosecutor saw it. The defense saw it. And Ethan Brooks, sitting on the witness stand, saw it too. His small fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. I asked for the video to be paused. On the screen, Richard Whitmore's face was turned slightly toward the camera. Grainy, but clear enough, the courtroom had changed now. At the beginning of that hearing, Whitmore had been the respectable businessman, and Ethan had been the homeless boy under suspicion. But evidence has a way of rearranging power. In one frozen frame, the rich man became the question. And the child became the reason the question could no longer be ignored. I ordered Thomas Grady to be seated near the court officer until the matter could be addressed. He walked forward slowly, his boots making dull sounds against the floor. I watched his hands. They were shaking, not the shaking of a man offended by accusation, the shaking of a man who had carried something too long. Miss Bennett requested a recess to confer with investigators. Mr. Wells objected, demanding the complaint remain limited to the money. He argued that the court was being emotionally manipulated by an old missing person case with no body, no direct evidence, and no formal charge against his client. Legally, he was doing his job. Morally, he was standing in front of a door that had already begun to open. I granted a short recess, but I did not leave immediately. I remained seated for several seconds, watching the courtroom begin to breathe again. Jurors whispered. Spectators leaned toward one another. Ethan stepped down from the witness stand, and Karen Miller guided him back to his seat. Before he sat, Ethan looked at Thomas Grady, and Grady looked away. That moment mattered. Children are often told they do not understand adult situations, but sometimes they understand the emotional truth faster than anyone else. Ethan did not know the legal terms. He did not know evidence procedure. He did not know admissibility standards. But he knew avoidance. He knew guilt when it refused to meet his eyes. When we returned from recess, Miss Bennett's tone had changed. There was something sharper beneath her calm. She informed the court that investigators had located an old missing person report from 8 years earlier. Marissa Brooks had been last seen at the Lakeside Motor Lodge, an abandoned property that, at the time, was under redevelopment by one of Richard Whitmore's companies. That made several jurors sit up straighter. Whitmore's attorney immediately objected again, but the connection had been made. The motel was not random. The man Ethan remembered was not random. The envelope was not random, and now Thomas Grady was no longer a name buried in old paperwork. He was sitting in the courtroom. Miss Bennett asked permission to question him under oath for limited purposes. I allowed it. Thomas Grady rose like a man walking toward a sentence he had been serving privately for years. When he reached the witness stand, he raised his right hand. His voice shook when he swore to tell the truth. Miss Bennett began carefully. Mr. Grady? Did you place the leather envelope behind Mr. Whitmore's office building? He closed his eyes. Yes, the courtroom stirred. I struck the gavel once. Why? Miss Bennett asked. Grady swallowed. Because Mr. Whitmore told me to. Richard Whitmore turned toward him then, not fully, just enough. But the look on his face was something I will never forget. It was not shock. It was command. The silent warning of a man used to being obeyed. Grady saw it and immediately looked down. Miss Bennett stepped closer. What was inside the envelope when you placed it there? Money, he said. Anything else? He hesitated, then he said, not anymore. Not anymore, 2 words, but every person in that room felt the floor shift beneath them. Miss Bennett asked, what do you mean, not anymore? Grady's face reddened. There used to be papers inside. Ethan leaned forward. Karen Miller put a hand in front of him gently, as if to keep him from standing. What papers? Miss Bennett asked. Grady breathed in hard. I never read all of them. I only saw a few. Copies of checks, property forms, photos, a letter. A letter from whom? Grady's eyes moved toward Ethan, then away. Marissa Brooks. At that, Ethan made a sound so small that many people missed it. I did not. It was not a cry. It was the sound of a child hearing proof that his mother had left something behind and realizing the world had almost erased it. Miss Bennett asked Grady, what happened to those papers? His hands began shaking harder. I burned them. The words came out broken. The gallery reacted loudly this time. I ordered silence, but even my voice felt different in that moment. Because destruction of evidence is not merely a legal act, it is a moral violence. It says the truth existed and someone chose fire over accountability, Miss Bennett asked. Who told you to burn them? Grady looked at Richard Whitmore. He did not need to say the name, but he did. Mr. Whitmore, for the first time all morning, Richard Whitmore spoke loudly enough for the courtroom to hear. He's lying. 2 words, clean, cold, controlled, but I heard something underneath them. Not fear. Rage, because Thomas Grady had broken the oldest rule of men like Whitmore. He had spoken. Mr. Wells requested that the testimony be struck. He argued coercion, confusion, bias, alcoholism, employment disputes. He threw every possible shadow at Thomas Grady in less than 2 minutes. That is a common defense strategy. When the facts become dangerous, attack the vessel carrying them. But Grady was not finished. He gripped the witness stand and said, I did what he told me because I was scared, but I didn't know she had a kid with her. I didn't know until later. Miss Bennett turned. Didn't know what, Mr. Grady? His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Richard Whitmore stood, not his lawyer. Whitmore himself. Your Honor, I demand this circus ends now. I looked down at him, and I remember thinking that power reveals itself most clearly when it is interrupted. He was not asking for order. He was trying to regain ownership of the room. I told him to sit down. He did not move immediately. That was another mistake. Juries notice when a man refuses to obey the court but expects everyone else to obey him. Slowly, Whitmore sat. Thomas Grady was crying now, silently, shamefully, like a man who hated himself but feared the truth more than his own guilt. Miss Bennett asked again, what didn't you know until later? Grady looked at Ethan, and this time he did not look away. I didn't know the boy saw us that night. The courtroom went completely still. Ethan's face drained of color. I leaned forward. Mr. Grady, I said, be very careful with your next words. He nodded, tears running down his face. I thought he was asleep, Grady whispered. We all thought he was asleep. And that was when Ethan Brooks stood up from his seat and said the words that turned this hearing into something far more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. I wasn't asleep. By the time Richard Whitmore stood to hear the verdict, he no longer looked like the man who had entered my courtroom. The perfect tie was still there. The expensive suit was still pressed. The silver watch still rested on his wrist. But the control was gone, and when control leaves a man like Richard Whitmore, what remains underneath is often far more revealing than guilt. It is entitlement. He looked at the jury as if they had betrayed him personally, not as citizens doing their duty, not as people who had listened to evidence and reached a decision. He looked at them like employees who had failed to follow instructions. I had seen that look before. Powerful people sometimes confuse influence with innocence. But a courtroom, at its best, is the one room where a man's money is supposed to sit lower than the truth. The four-person rows, Ethan Brooks sat between Karen Miller and Assistant District Attorney Laura Bennett. His shoulders were tense, but his eyes were open. He did not look down anymore. That mattered to me. When this case began, Ethan looked like a child who expected the world to punish him for telling the truth. Now he looked frightened, yes, but also present, as if, for the first time in years, he believed his mother's name could survive the men who tried to bury it. The clerk asked the foreperson for the verdict. The room held its breath. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty. Richard Whitmore blinked once, no expression. On the charge of destruction and concealment of evidence, guilty. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty. Thomas Grady, who had testified under a plea agreement, lowered his head and began to cry silently. And on the charge of manslaughter in connection with the death of Marissa Brooks, the foreperson paused. I watched Ethan's hands tighten around Karen Miller's. Guilty. The sound that left that courtroom was not cheering. It was not celebration. Justice does not always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like a locked door opening after years of darkness. Ethan closed his eyes. Karen Miller wrapped one arm around him, and for several seconds he did not move. Then his face broke, not with loud crying, not with performance, but with the exhausted grief of a boy who had been carrying an adult-sized truth since he was 4 years old. I have sentenced people for decades. I have heard verdicts that changed families forever, but I will never forget that child sitting there, crying without making a sound, because the world had finally admitted what he had always known. His mother had not abandoned him. She had been taken from him, and the man responsible had spent 8 years hiding behind charity galas, polished speeches, and photographs with people who never asked where his money came from before sentencing. Richard Whitmore was given the right to speak. That right matters. Even guilty men have rights. Even men who denied others their voice must be allowed to use their own. He stood slowly. For a moment, I thought he might apologize. Not because I believed he had changed, but because men like him sometimes attempt remorse when all other strategies fail. But Richard Whitmore did not apologize. He looked at me and said, "This court has been manipulated by emotion." There it was. Not regret, not sorrow, strategy, he continued. A confused boy, a desperate former employee, and an ambitious prosecutor turned an accident into a public execution of my character. I watched the jury. Several of them stared at him with a kind of quiet disbelief because they had seen the evidence. They had heard Thomas Grady explain how Whitmore ordered him to burn Marissa's documents after she threatened to expose illegal property schemes involving shelters and low-income housing contracts. They had heard how Marissa had discovered forged tenant records, missing funds, and payments routed through false companies. Most importantly, they had heard Ethan. Not as a perfect witness, as a human one. He remembered the motel carpet, the broken vending machine, his mother's shaking hands, the brown envelope, the argument, the words no child should ever hear. If she talks, nobody will believe a woman like her. But Marissa Brooks had been believed, not while she was alive. And that is the tragedy. The system did not save her in time, but in that courtroom, at least, it refused to let her disappear twice. When Whitmore finished speaking, I waited. Judges must be careful with silence. Silence can punish. Silence can protect. Silence can give weight to words that deserve to be felt. Then I addressed him. Mr. Whitmore, throughout this trial, I watched you very carefully. I watched you when Ethan Brooks first entered this courtroom. I watched you when the envelope was displayed. I watched you when Marissa Brooks's fingerprint was identified. I watched you when Thomas Grady confessed. And I watched you when that child described the night his mother vanished. He stared at me, coldly, defiantly. But what I never saw, I said, was grief. The courtroom remained still. I saw anger, I saw calculation, I saw contempt, but I did not see one moment of sorrow for the woman who died or for the boy who grew up believing his honesty might destroy him. His jaw tightened. There it was again, the mask fighting to stay in place. I continued. You believed poverty made Marissa Brooks disposable. You believed homelessness made Ethan Brooks unreliable. You believed money could turn truth into rumor and fear into silence. I leaned forward slightly, but this court has learned something very different. Sometimes the person with nothing left to lose is the only person brave enough to tell the truth. Ethan looked up at me then, and I will admit this to you. For a moment, I struggled to continue, not because I did not know the law. The law was clear, but because every judge, if he has sat long enough, eventually meets a case that reminds him the bench is not made of wood alone. It is made of responsibility. And responsibility becomes heavy when a child is sitting before you, waiting to know whether truth has any protection in this world. I sentenced Richard Whitmore to prison, not for being wealthy, not for being hated, not because the public wanted a villain. I sentenced him because the evidence proved that he used power to hide corruption, used fear to silence a vulnerable woman, and used the legal system itself as a weapon against her child. That was the part that disturbed me most. He did not merely commit a crime. He tried to make the court punish the boy who exposed it. When the sentence was read, Whitmore finally reacted, not with tears, with disbelief, as though prison was something that happened to other men. As deputies moved toward him, he turned his head toward Ethan. For one brief second, I saw the old command return to his face, the same look Thomas Grady had feared, the same look Ethan had frozen under. But this time, Ethan did not look away. That child, still trembling, still wounded, still carrying more pain than any child should carry, looked directly back at him, and Richard Whitmore was the first one to turn away. I will remember that longer than the verdict, because justice is not only a sentence. Sometimes justice is the moment a victim stops lowering his eyes. After the courtroom emptied, I remained on the bench for a while. Judges do that sometimes, not because we are dramatic, because some cases leave behind an echo. The evidence bags were gone. The jury had been dismissed. The lawyers had packed their files. The gallery was empty. But I could still see Ethan standing at the police station with $10,000 in his hands. Choosing honesty in a world that had given him every reason not to. Think about that. A homeless boy found enough money to change his life for a while. Food, clothes, a warm room, maybe even safety, and he gave it back. Not because the world had been fair to him, but because his mother had taught him to remain decent even when life was not. That is why this case stayed with me, not because of Richard Whitmore. Men like him are not as rare as we wish they were. This case stayed with me because of Marissa Brooks, a mother who tried to expose the truth before it destroyed more people, and because of Ethan Brooks, a boy the world kept overlooking until his honesty forced everyone to look. Years on the bench have taught me that evil is often loud in private and respectable in public. It wears suits, it donates money, it smiles in photographs, it learns the language of kindness while practicing cruelty behind closed doors. But truth has a strange way of surviving. Sometimes it survives in a fingerprint, sometimes in an old video file, sometimes in a burned document someone remembers, and sometimes it survives inside a child who refuses to keep what does not belong to him. So when people ask me which cases I remember most, I do not always speak of the bloodiest ones. I remember the quiet ones, the ones where a small act of honesty cracks open a buried darkness, the ones where a forgotten voice finally reaches the courtroom. And the ones that remind me why justice must never depend on how powerful someone looks or how poor someone appears. Because on that day, in my courtroom, a homeless boy found $10,000. But what he truly uncovered was something far more valuable, the truth, and the truth gave his mother her name back.